All right. So in the next half an hour or so, Phil, Song, and I will be talking about halo boundaries and assembly bias. So I will basically be giving a review of the halo boundary or the splashback radius, and essentially why we are interested in it and why we care about it. And also, I will be discussing some recent work that I've been doing with observations of the splashback radius. So the splashback radius or the splashback surface more generally can be thought of as essentially a physical boundary of the halo. It essentially separates the multi-streaming or the virialized region of the halo where particles or galaxies are in orbits within the halo from the infall region around it. So it's a surface that's made of the most recently accreted matter. It's a surface that's essentially composed of the apocenters of the most recently accreted matter that falls into the halo. So essentially, outside of that, there's no other particle or halo that has been on any orbit inside the halo. Right. So the boundary is particularly clear in phase space. In the phase space of dark matter halo, which is the radial velocity versus the cluster-centric or the halocentric radius. And essentially, essentially we see that at the edge, so essentially you can clearly separate this virialized region from this infall region. And in fact, if you had idealized halos, you would see a very sharp caustic at the edge of the halo. So recently, not recently anymore, Dima Kravtsov and some early work that we did in 2014, we saw that essentially the density profile of the halo becomes very narrow, very steep in a very narrow localized region at the edge, which traces this boundary between the virialized and the infall region, and we call that radius where the slope reaches a minimum. The bottom panel here is showing the logarithmic slope of the density profile as a function of the radius, and the location at which the slope reaches a minimum traces this boundary of transition between the two regions. So the physics that essentially sets the location of this feature is quite simple and intuitive, which is why which is one of the reasons why it is interesting to me. It's essentially set by the gravitational collapse of particles onto a halo, and the boundaries tracing the apocenters. So you essentially just have to solve the orbits of these particles. And over work that's been done in the last few years, we've seen that this, I've enlisted here a few of the reasons why we think this feature may be interesting. And of course, it it gives a dynamical physical definition of the boundary of the halo, of halo mass. Apart from that, it also traces the growth history or the accretion history of the halo. It's also a length scale inside the halo structure, essentially, which should be present if we have dark matter. And it's also, traced by the most recently accreted material that has not been inside the halo for a very long time. So it might be tracing some of the initial conditions. And also observationally, or just generally in terms of trying to get more physics out of it, it's a feature that occurs at the edge of the halo, in the outskirts of the halo, a region which is less affected, especially for massive halos, by baryonic effects. There's been some very encouraging development on the observational side, because we can also, it's accessible observationally for massive clusters. We also see this profile, just like in dark matter particles, we also see it in substructure or satellite galaxies inside of it. Right. So just going over some of them briefly, and some recent work that has been done in relation to that. Of course, the fact that this is being established as a halo boundary, a lot of interesting work has been done by Benedict Deemer and Phil Mansfield, who are both here in trying to find these edges and define these surfaces in simulations. In particular, Phil has been working on the shellfish algorithm to find asymmetric edges, and Benedict's work has been tracing particle orbits to define the edges. And you should look at some recent work by Benedict where he's actually published halo catalogs and merger trees from splashback defined halos. There's also recent work on understanding assembly bias in the context of splashback radius, which Phil will talk about later, and also the mass function. When you define halos based on the splashback radius, you ultimately see the universality of the mass function, which maybe we can talk about more during discussion. And finally, some of the aspects that I have been interested in is given that this feature is the location of this feature is set by some very simple physics, what happens when you relax these different conditions, or what happens when you change, for example, the fundamental nature of gravity or the fundamental nature of dark matter particles. So I've been interested in looking at what happens to the splashback radius in modified gravity models. There's also some work by Contagiani, 2018, who have also looked at splashback radius and modified gravity. Essentially, galaxies or particles are falling in from a transition region of enhanced gravity into a region where, into a dense region where gravity goes back to G. And this has interesting effects on the dynamics and the velocities with which the galaxies fall in. In particular, in our paper in 2018, we found that subhalos, because in modified gravity models, they tend to fall in with higher velocities, the effect of dynamical friction is reduced, and therefore, if you look at splashback radius as a function of galaxy mass, you see signatures that differ from a normal GR model where dynamical friction is more important. Right, and we've also looked at it in self-interacting dark matter. We only find effects on it when the interaction cross-sections are very large and for subsets of halos, and we only find that we see these effects based on the history of the halo. We see that in, sorry, this should be reversed. We see that in older halos, there's a very small shift in the splashback radius if you have your cross sections as high as 3 centimeters square per gram in the cluster regime, and for younger halos, we don't see this effect. Right. So in the last few minutes, I'll talk about the work that we've been doing as far as observations of the splashback radius go, and in particular, I've been involved in working with the dark energy survey to measure the splashback radius in galaxy clusters, and there's been work. The first results were essentially from Moore et al., who looked at the splashback radius in red mapper clusters in SDSS, followed by the dark energy survey year 1 results, where we measured the splashback radius in the galaxy density around red mapper clusters, and also in the weak cleansing of galaxies around red mapper clusters. And the top panel here shows the gray curve in the top panel here shows the splashback radius in galaxies. And in the bottom panel, the pink curve shows the splashback radius in weak lensing. And in both these cases, for red mapper clusters, we found a 20% discrepancy, which was consistently seen in most red mapper measurements of the splashback radius. Some follow-up work to understand more where that discrepancy comes from. We've also looked at, and if that comes in through cluster selection, we've also looked at clusters selected using SZ instead of optically selected clusters, and a work led by Tae-Hyun Shin. We measured the splashback radius in SPT clusters, and it's shown here in this pink curve. And essentially, we found it to be consistent with theoretical predictions, and for the mass range of clusters that we were looking at. And more recently, this is very recent work, and it should be out hopefully in the archive next week. So we are looking, so in Shin et al. 2018, we looked at a set of 300 SZ selected clusters where the signal to noise was not very high, but currently we're looking at a much larger sample, or a larger sample of SZ selected clusters, and we see we essentially looked at around 1,000 ACT clusters, and these are the results from the ACT clusters. The different colors, and also with these clusters, we look at the splashback radius as a function of galaxy color. So we look at the slope profiles as a function of color essentially, and we find that there's some evidence of shift between the location of the minimum location of the steepest slope between these different colors. So that's one of the things that we're investigating in this recent work. And so we think that one of the possible pictures of what could be happening with galaxies of different colors as they fall into the halo is essentially that the location of the steepest slope shifts, because for them the boundary between the multi-stream and the single infall stream shifts as a function of galaxy color. Essentially, a galaxy as it falls into a halo traverses the path from the infall regime out over here. This is a complete orbit, but if a galaxy if population of galaxy quenches before it reaches the apocenter, before it reaches the splashback radius, the transition from this double stream region or the multi-stream region to the single infall stream region shifts to a different location. So we also look at this in simulations. We split galaxies based on their infall times, and we measure where the location of the steepest slope is in their density profiles. And we find that as a function of infall time, we can see that the location of this feature moves. And therefore, using that insight, we try to estimate when the observed galaxies fell into the clusters. And essentially, we find that the red galaxy is a population that contains galaxies that have been accreted more than 3.2 gigayears ago, whereas the green ones are likely to have been accreted not more than 2.3 to 3.2 gigayears. And the blue population is a more recently accreted population that has not yet reached apocenter and has not been inside the halo for more than 1.5 gigayears. We also fit a simple quenching model to this. We also use the entire color fraction profile, and we basically try to constrain the quenching timescales, an exponential quenching timescale and a delay time for a star formation rate, assuming that galaxies go from blue to red with star formation quenching. And we find an exponential timescale of 0.6 gigayears and after a delay of about a gigayear, which is close to the pericentric passage time of galaxies into clusters. So yeah, so that's basically recent observational work that we've been doing, and I'll end there because I think I'm out of time. And thank you all. This is just a picture from the Splashback workshop last year. It's a small group. This does not include everybody. It's a small group and it's growing. So I'm excited to hear what others have to say. Thank you.
All right, we're going to hold questions for Susmita till the end because we're already a little bit over. So let's go ahead. Susmita, are you projecting all of the talks or just yours? Okay, Phil.
I think Phil has.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, great. Thank you, Susmita. So I'm going to give a lightning overview of the theory behind galaxy mass assembly bias, which is a phenomenon that has showed up in a lot of the talks so far today. So what I'm showing here is a slice through a cosmological simulation, and every dot in these plots shows the position of a roughly Milky Way mass dark matter halo. And I split it up so that young halos which are growing very rapidly, are in the left-hand plot, and old halos, ones which have kind of stopped growing maybe a couple billion years ago or so and are probably going to stay at that mass for a long time, are in the right-hand plot. And what you can see by eye is that there's a very strong difference in the clustering between these two populations. So you can see there's like this little structure made out of filaments that looks like a stick figure here, and there's a lot more tight clustering for the old halos than for the young halos. And so this difference in clustering that's based off of age is known as assembly bias. And the reason that we care about it so much is because almost any halo property that you could possibly care about is correlated with halo age. So just as a review, I'm going to use some cartoons here. So this left cartoon is going to be a young halo, one that's actively growing, and the right cartoon is going to be an old or a dying halo, one that isn't growing or is losing mass. So older halos are more concentrated, so their central regions are smaller and have higher densities. They rotate more slowly. They have less substructure, and their substructure is less massive than it is for rapidly accreting halos. They relax into rounder shapes, and that relaxation also means that their center of mass is closer to the center of their potential. And the splashback radius expands. And sort of all of these processes have been worked out theoretically over the years. And so the difference is not quite as exaggerated as the cartoons I have here, but it does mean that these objects are fairly different from one another. And there's a chance that this is a difference that also propagates into the galaxies inside of these halos. So this is a plot that you might remember from Jorit's talk, or at least a version of it. So every dot here is a galaxy from the Eagle simulation, with halo mass on the x-axis and stellar mass on the y-axis, and they're colored by age. So these red dots up here are very old halos, and these blue dots down here are very young ones. And the takeaway from this is that the Eagle model predicts that different age halos should have different galaxy halo connection relations, that a lot of the scatter is coming from age. And this is a prediction of many different simulation models, as well as a number of different semi-empirical models. You know, some of these models may predict that this also propagates to changes in color or star formation rate or dust extinction or a whole host of our favorite friends. Now, I wouldn't say that this is a done deal. So there are a couple observational papers that complicate the picture a little bit. One I want to highlight in particular is something that Peter talked about earlier, which was Christine O'Donnell's recent paper, which sort of argued that specific star formation rate and halo accretion rate are at best uncorrelated from one another according to their methods. So I would very strongly suggest reading this if you're interested in the topic. But the takeaway of these correlations is that the statement of assembly bias really means that halos and possibly the galaxies inside of them look and behave differently in different parts of the universe. So if you're doing analysis which cares both about the stuff inside of a dark matter halo, what it looks like inside of the outer boundary, and you care about the locations of those dark matter halos, then assembly bias is something that you have to sort of deal with at some level. And a lot of our efforts to deal with assembly bias or to mitigate its effects on our analysis are hampered by the fact that it's difficult to tell why this is happening, at least at galaxy scales. So there are fairly robust models once you go high above the nonlinear mass scale. And I'm just going to overview briefly some of those different models. So one of the very popular ones is the tidal fields from individual large dark matter halos. So if you're a galaxy mass dark matter halo that's near a galaxy cluster, the region around you where you are gravitationally dominant is smaller than if you're further away. So this is known as the Hill radius of the object. And what this means is further away halos can attract matter from larger distances, and they can grow at higher rates than those that are nearby. And it means that you would expect halos to be shifted to older ages the closer they get to these massive objects. And galaxy clusters experience heavy mass bias. So they're much more common in dense regions relative to their average density than galaxy mass halos are, which means that this effect is a way to statistically shift the ages of galaxy mass dark matter halos in these dense regions relative to the rest of the universe, which can lead to the assembly bias signal. So this is going to be one of the 4 different approaches that I'll just outline here. Another approach is our friend the splashback radius. So imagine that you have some dark matter halo that's falling into, again, a massive cluster or some other big halo. And it goes on some orbit that just sort of innocently takes it through the splashback radius, but briefly goes outside of the virial radius, which is this sort of non-physical definition that we're often forced to use. So what would happen is this halo would be categorized as a central dark matter halo and be included in the assembly bias analysis. But the issue is that this halo is super old. So it hasn't accreted anything while it's been within the tidal field of the galaxy cluster. And when it went through pericenter, it went through this huge shock and lost a bunch of matter. So the effect is that if you don't account for the splashback radius, every galaxy cluster in the universe looks like it's surrounded by a swarm of dead galaxy mass dark matter halos. So this is sort of another explanation that people have proposed. So a third one is that, galaxy clusters and halos aren't the only things that have large tidal fields. So large scale structure itself has its own tidal fields. So, you have halos that are out in the void, you have halos that are in these dense filaments, and the filaments have their own tidal field that's infused throughout them. And just like the cluster, it sets the region of tidal influence for these objects. And so these objects inside of tidal fields will likely have smaller regions of influence. I've put down one of the ways that you can calculate this, but there's sort of a menagerie of them, including tidal anisotropy and things like this. And so the result of this effect would be that objects inside of these filaments become older again. And because these filaments are dense, it leads to the clustering differential based on age. And then sort of the last explanation that people bring up is gravitational heating. There are others, but these are sort of the major ones. So what I'm showing here is a phase diagram around a stack of galaxy mass dark matter halos from a simulation. Position is on the x-axis, velocity is on the y-axis, and the number of particles at that location it corresponds to the color. And so here I've split it by local density. So objects in dense regions are shown on the left, and underdense regions are shown on the right. And so the objects in dense regions have a large velocity dispersion in their outskirts, and the ones in underdense regions have a much smaller velocity dispersion. But the thing is that these halos really only have access to the particles whose velocities are below the escape velocity of the halo, which I've shown as this red line right here, or this black line right there. And so you can just go and do an integral under these things. I'm showing a simple version of it that doesn't take the tidal field into account, but you would actually have to take the tidal field into account to do this correctly. And the result that you get is that these objects in dense regions, before you even take tides into account, have less matter that they can accrete, even though they're in denser regions. So the result is that these objects in these large structures, due to the depth of the local gravitational well, become older. So that sort of leads us with the four explanations that people are usually talking about for this effect. So tidal fields from large halos, misidentified splashback subhalos, and then these two effects from large-scale structure. And so the challenge that I would just leave us on is it would be good to know whether or not these theoretical advances that have been made in understanding where assembly bias comes from can be leveraged to, say, create better galaxy models or to better understand the impact of assembly bias on our measurements. So, for example, Beatrice Tucci showed that there is basically no spin assembly bias below the nonlinear mass scale once you get rid of splashback subhalos. Maybe that's something that we can take advantage of. And in a paper that I wrote on concentration and formation time assembly bias, I showed that most of the signal was due to splashback subhalos, and some of it was due to this large-scale structure. Maybe there's something in this difference between variables that we can take advantage of. So I'll leave you on this note as something that you can think about, and I'll switch off to Song.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Song. Fantastic. We'll take questions for Phil at the end.
Okay, hope everyone can see my slides and hear me. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Song Huang. I'm a postdoc at Princeton. So I will be talking more specifically about the observational side of this topic. And even more specifically, I will talk about the measurement of splashback radii for massive dark matter halos. So I think given the topic, it's appropriate to say that recently there's a big splash of papers on how to measure splashback radii. And so I highly recommend this web page organized by Benedict Diemer. There's an almost complete list of observational works on splashback radii. So you will see that soon after the idea was proposed, people have been attempting to actually measure it. And robust detection first made back in 2016. And right now, I think we can generally say that the splashback radii around massive clusters out to redshift 1 have selected in different ways and have been robustly measured in different methods. I will just quickly highlight two recent work. First is this Chang 2017 from DES using red mapper, red sequence richness cluster finders. And what's interesting here is that for the same cluster sample, consistent splashback radius measurement have been made using both the galaxy density profile and the GG lensing profiles, and which is great news. And recently, there's also a very interesting paper by Tomoka 2020, basically also see a very relevant phase-space structure. And the second work I want to mention is that this work by Leoma Mulata in 2020, using deep HSE image survey and a different red sequence cluster finder, Camila. What's special here is that you can see that using deep HSE images, splashback radius now can be reliably measured out to redshift 0.8, 0.9 for massive clusters. So these are great. Now we can say we actually can measure halo boundary now. So how far away from actually using it to study halo assembly and basically release its physical power to study dark matter halo. So probably not too fast because there's still a lot to understand in all those measurements. So here is a really nice summary figure from Mulatto 2020. X-axis here is just a cluster redshift of different sample. Y-axis is actually the observationally inferred 3D splashback radius, and it's ratio to the model prediction. And the figure actually summarized clusters selected using 2 different red sequence cluster finder and 2 samples selected using SD effect. So we can see a lot of going on here. The first thing we notice that a lot of the measurement from observation are actually lower than model prediction. This is especially true for richness selected one. But actually, if we look at the richness cluster finder, there's also different behavior among different methods. For example, the Kamila seem to be more consistent with their model. The main difference between RedMapper and Kamila is Kamila doesn't use a scale radii for the cluster that depend on the richness, which could affect its splashback radius measurement. And we also see that the cluster selected using SD effect, their splashback radius measurement tend to be more consistent with model prediction, although the error bar is pretty large. And also there's a maybe potential redshift dependence and also richness trend. For example, for RedMapper clusters, people seem to find that more discrepancy with model happen at higher richness bit. So needless to say that we need to understand all this measurement before we can actually use this interesting feature for physics. And that's not easy because splashback radius is a rather new idea and it's also a very tricky measurement. So I want to highlight this work led by graduate student Anya Jakar at UCSC. So we are trying to use multi-dark Planck 2 simulation with Sparta splashback radius measurement in 3D and try to study its relationship with halo accretion rate. So on the left side, the x-axis is the halo accretion rate within one dynamic of time. The y-axis is splashback radius measured in different way. So I have to keep reminding myself that splashback radius in simulation defined by the basically epicenter of the trajectory of infalling particles. And given the large number of particles and wide range of orbits, so we also have a wide range of epicenter. So you can define splashback radius using different statistics. For example, if you look at the green and the pink shaded region, those are defined in Sparta using 50 and 87% percentile of their epicenter. And they're clearly short-term difference. And we also see that the splashback radius measured using the 3D mass density profile and the 3D subhalo density profile show difference, which they correspond to basically splashback radius measured using different statistics. This is actually very interesting. It may hint that the splashback radius measured using, say, GG lensing and galaxy density profile, there could be some difference. And we also see on the left corner, there's a weird data point. Basically, when the accretion rate is low, the inference using the DK14 parametric profile fitting give very weird and wrong result. And that's actually because when the accretion rate is low, the second causative feature become much more visible and start to bother the measurement of the splashback radius we want. And this is also can affect observations. But in real observation, we're dealing with much more severe systematic effect, which is projection effect. And we basically know every time you use a richness cluster finder, you're dealing with projection effect. It actually bothers a lot of things, including the study of assembly bias. For example, a couple of years ago, people used to think that using RedMapper clusters with different concentration of member galaxy, people can detect pretty significant assembly bias signal. But later, there's a serious work that basically proved that this is caused by projection effect. And recently, there's a work by Tomomi Sonayama and Server Moore, and basically show that the same projection effect also affects your measurement of splashback radii. So for example, using mock RedMapper cluster catalog with different concentration of member galaxies, in 3D density profile, you can see that these two subsample of cluster, basically they have, at the same cell mass, they basically have the same 3D splashback radii. However, when projecting in 2D, you clearly see a difference, which is completely due to the projection effect. And this is not only because it's really annoying. Another annoying part about the projection effect is very hard to model properly. Basically, it's very hard to mimic the behavior of the color of galaxy and depend on redshift and the cluster finders, all those systematics. So how should we go from here? So here's just quickly mention one of my proposals. So if you look at the image of a massive cluster, you clearly see overdensity of red galaxy, but you also see that there is bright central galaxies, which we know whose stellar mass correlate with the halo mass. It's just we used to think that the correlation is not as tight as the richness of galaxies. However, things have changed because deeper and deeper imaging survey reveal more and more details about their stellar structures. So this is using HIC. So in the last couple of years, we have been studying the stellar outskirt of massive central galaxy using HIC images. Although we are reliably measure the halo boundary now, so I still haven't found where is the edge of massive galaxy, even on the steep images. But we do learn that in the stellar outskirt, there's a lot to learn about the dark matter halo. For example, we know that at basically same stellar mass, the galaxy with more prominent stellar halo, they tend to live in more massive halos and dark matter halos, and we can build a model that. That actually can help you to use central galaxy alone to predict halo mass and even halo properties. So there is a multiple advantage of that. For example, you're using basically one galaxy. Almost there's no projection effect. And you only care about the stellar mass of one galaxy, so it's much easier to forward a model. And it also have more potential at a higher redshift and at lower halo mass, where richness tend to break down. So we quickly checked this idea using HIC, deep image, and the unprecedented GG lensing capability. Our idea is very simple. So we just evaluate different measurement of stellar mass or different part of the galaxy and try to see which part actually is a better proxy of halo mass. And we are using GG lensing signal of massive halo selected different way in the same number density bin. So basically, you can imagine that we select the top 50 or top 50 to top 100 most massive halos given certain observational proxies, and we compare their GG lensing signals. So we think the one that with higher amplitude, they should be the one with better, they correlate better with dark matter halo. So for example, one of the very interesting we learned is that the outskirt of massive galaxy actually care more about their dark matter halo than even the total mass of the galaxy. Here you show that stellar mass between 50 to 100 kpc and their GG lensing signal at the same number density is consistently higher than the total stellar mass with 100 kpc aperture. And you can see it more clearly using the ratio of the sigma profiles. And more importantly, we build a very simple model with assumption of log linear mass observable relation with Gaussian scatter. And we try to feed those profiles, try to extract the scatter of the halo mass distribution within each bin. And this also shows that the outer stellar mass actually is a better halo mass proxy. And we actually examined this using different halo mass bins from low halo mass to very high halo mass. And as an observer, we only care about the scatter of halo mass at a given observable in each of the bin. So larger scatter means your worse observation proxy, lower scatter means you're better. What we find is actually, so you don't want to use stellar mass based on the default photometry from your survey, like C model. You want to use, say, the large aperture stellar mass, or even the stellar mass just in the outskirt of the stellar halo. And you can also try to build some model that take the stellar distribution in the outskirt into account. And once you can do that, you see that basically we can build a competitive halo mass proxy that competitive to even the richness selection. So here the red star are the red mapper cluster finders. I want to remind everyone here that scatter here, the value is only for each bin. And the value is based on our naive model. So you should care more about the relative comparison. And there's more to that because at the same number density bins, we also notice that the GG lensing profile of richness selected clusters and our stellar mass based samples show systematically different profiles. On the left side, I compare the random mapper profiles and the stellar mass one using the outskirt stellar mass. You can see that there's some systematic difference. And while the stellar mass selected sample can be well described by our simple model with a log linear mass observable relation and just Gaussian scatter, the red mapper and other red sequence cluster finder can't. And there is a systematic trend is also very interesting. We see that the cluster, the richness clusters, they tend to have lower amplitude inter-GG lensing signal than the stellar mass-based one at the same number density, while consistently higher in the outskirt. So we are still trying to decode what this means. So it could be the contribution from off-center clusters. It could be projection effect. For example, in recent works by Tsuneyama to 2020, they find a similar trend. There could also be other things. So I think this is very interesting. So in the end, I just want to quickly mention that I think there, going forward, we need to try to understand the selection of massive halos better and try to overcome this projection effect in richness selections. There are many different ways to do that. And so for example, you can use X3 cluster, SD selected clusters, or trying to build better selections using, say, the magnitude gap, or even the stellar mass of the few massive satellite galaxy, like what we show in Christopher Brashaw's work 2019. And in the future, we can also make prediction to say that basically once we have survey like RSST, we can reliably measure the splashback radius and use it to infer dynamical, the halo accretion rate in a dynamical time. And by then, we can really release the full potential of splashback radius. Basically, the future is bright. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks to all of our speakers. So we have some questions appearing in the Q&A. You're also welcome to just raise your hand and ask a question. So feel free to do that. Andrew, Andrew Huron, can you ask your question for Song?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Risa. I asked, so Song, I'm just reading from the Google Doc. One of the main challenges of RedMapper-based observations of the splashback radius ultimately derives from the challenge of producing high-quality mock catalogs that meet RedMapper's algorithm requirements. So I think you're essentially advocating for an alternative summary statistic to quantify and measure and predict splashback radius. And so I'm just wondering whether with your method, is it easier to make reliable mocks for testing purposes? Is this an easier problem to solve?
I would say it's easier than say the richness cluster. So I think the most difficult part is basically satellite contribution from satellite galaxies. So right now, all the results I show actually include massive satellite galaxy. But we think that at very high mass, high stellar mass end, the satellite fraction is very low. So right now, its impact is not very big. But so this is actually not my expertise, but I think Christopher Brashaw is trying to build more realistic model that take the satellite contribution into account. And eventually, I think we were hoping that when DESI is online, that we can actually reliably identify the massive central and the massive satellite galaxy. And I'm not sure that answered your question, but that's.
Okay, Susmita had a question for Song as well.
Hi, Song, that's really nice. For when selecting on stellar mass, do you worry about other selection effects like your stellar light, how it depends on the concentration of the halo and things like that? Would you be selecting like how the starlight correlates with other properties of the halo profile, essentially?
Yes. So so that's actually so one of the ideas we want to compare the stellar mass based selection and richness based selection is also trying to understand what's the underlying difference of those massive halos, because given their GG lensing signal, we know they're all massive halos. So right now, I don't think I have a perfect answer for your question because there is something I still need to learn. But one thing I can say is that if you look at this this background shaded region, basically the model that fit our stellar mass based lensing lensing signal very well. Those are just very simple model based on n-body simulation. We literally just assume there is a very simple correlation between our observable and underlying halo mass, and with some scatter. And right now, I think the uncertainty on the delta sigma measurement is still not very good, but so far we find that the simple model can already can explain this observation really well. So I hope that that can convince someone that our stellar mass selection is not specifically biased toward halo with given concentration or given special properties. But I think you're right. Eventually, we need to look into this more carefully.
Okay, great. Just a reminder that we'll take questions for Phil, Susmita, or Song. Richie, you have a question for Song?
All right. Yeah, I was just wondering because Song mentioned that there is an issue with determining the stellar boundary for these massive BCGs. I was wondering if the flash talk that Alice Deason gave earlier, mentioning about the stellar caustics, could be a potential solution to connecting the stellar boundary with recent mergers, be a good definition for the stellar boundary as well as something that's similar to the Splashback Radius for halos.
So I think the challenge is to find the problem here is that this massive galaxy have a super extended stellar mass distribution, and they will extend into the so-called intra-cluster light regime. And basically, there's no right now. I don't think we find a clear separation between the in terms of the mass distribution. We see there's no clear boundary between the mass that follow the potential of the dark matter halo and maybe the cluster, the halo mass of the cluster. So and unfortunately, so unlike Milky Way, we do not have access to the kinematic information. So we don't really know anything about. We know very little about their phase space distribution. I would say one exception maybe. So people have been using tracers like global cluster and planetary nebula, trying to so those are basically they can be used as a kinematic tracer of the halo mass distribution, and people have found some interesting kinematic distribution between red, for example, red and blue global cluster population. But I don't think that's that clearly show basically the edge of the galaxy we want to see. Of this galaxy, they're truly very different from, say, the Milky Way. Their stellar mass distribution basically there's no down to the surface brightness level we can probe. We see basically there's no edge or no boundary.
Okay, we're almost officially out of time, but I'm going to make time for 2 more questions for those who are willing to stay. Peter has a question for Susmita, and then Annalisa has a question. Go ahead, Peter.
Hey, Susmita. Great talk. Just had a quick question about the interpretation of the blue versus red splashback radii. I was wondering, so if the blue satellites are living in halos that are younger, in other words, clusters that might have a higher blue fraction, is it that the splashback radii of those clusters is smaller, or is it just that the splashback radii of the satellites is smaller? So I was wondering if you could test this by looking, say, at fixed blue fraction for the clusters. Then for those halos, what's the difference between the red and blue splashback radii?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that test by itself is definitely interesting to try and take the blue fraction as a tracer of the accretion history. But I don't think the amount of shift that we see, I don't think that could be completely explained by differences in, say, accretion rate of the halo. And also the feature is much shallower. So generally for faster accreting halos, at least in simulations, we've seen sharper features. But yeah, so I don't think all of the difference can be explained by different ages for the clusters. But I do think that some, maybe between the red and the green galaxy, it is definitely possible that they are, they've been sampled from different history of halos, then that would be a really good check to do in general. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Annalisa.
Oh yeah, just quickly on this, actually very interesting. I just wanted to give the information, no? Like when we separate star-forming and quasar galaxies in cluster environment, we should not ever forget that there is a non-negligible fraction of quenched satellites in massive cluster who quench even before ever falling into the host where we find them today. And so also these distinctions between the star-forming red versus blue splashback radius should also take this pre-processing quenching into account at some point. We try to quantify this very clearly from TNG simulations. But actually, I had a question for Song, if I may. Since we are talking about boundaries of stellar halo or intracluster light, you, Song, mentioned that in your simulation, in your observations, you don't find any boundary at the moment between the stellar halo of the BCG and the intracluster light of the cluster. But this is a question for everybody. So long as you have a relaxed halos, can't we just consider the fact that the stellar halo of the BCG is the intracluster light of the halo cluster in which the BCG is sitting at the center? So what do you think?
Yes, I think you know my answer. I like the idea. Basically, I always advocate for not separating ICL and the stellar halo, and especially those both the star actually. I think most of them they all come from the accretion of smaller galaxies.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that's good. I would like to say that also there's evidence for that come from. So all I show here is based on 1D profile, but also right now they show given the shape. The 2D shape of the stellar halo and the ICL, and basically people find there are actually clearly correlation. Both of them are more elliptical than the central part of the galaxy, also indicated that they share the same origin, physical origin. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. This was really exciting and too short, but it was fantastic to see everyone and really, really wonderful to see all of these exciting results proving that this is still an extremely vibrant field. So we will convene again tomorrow at 8 a.m. Pacific. So I look forward to seeing everyone then. Thank you. And